And thanks to Freshfields for being such a great partner with Berkeley at this conference. It's great to see many of you I know, many of you I don't know, but my name is Frank Partnoy. I'm on the faculty at Berkeley, and we're going to talk national security. We're going to talk a lot of Russia, and uncertainty has emerged as a theme so far, so I think we're going to hear a fair amount about uncertainty. You heard a brief bio, you have his bio, but one of the advertisements of this program is to be able to look back and forward. And so we have the previous two administrations represented here with Aimen Mir, partner at Freshfields, who has held a number of national security jobs and CFIUS related jobs. And then Peter, are you there? All right, great.
I am indeed here. I hope you can hear me. I can see you great. I have no idea if folks there can see me, but I can see you guys, and appreciate you letting me speak virtually. As you said during the introduction, there's a lot going on, and while I would have absolutely loved to come out to San Francisco for the first time since I think December 2019, unfortunately, I'm going to have to wait another couple of months. But thanks for letting me join you virtually.
Well, thanks so much for being a part of this, and several people have implored me to say live from the White House. So I did have to do that, but let me give you a proper introduction first. You're the Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the NSC in the White House, and have held a number of jobs and I think are regarded as the leading national security expert on a number of the issues that we're going to touch on. You've been working on this for a long time, and I think many of the people who are here would like to have as good an up-to-date understanding as we can get from you, starting with Russia and the sanctions, about how you and the administration have been thinking about the sanctions in the context of their impact on business. So for people who are advising boards, thinking about how to make decisions and understand risk in the boardroom, help us out.
There's a lot to unpack there. And first, let me say I really appreciate you all having me on, and just great to see Aimen and many friends I know are in the audience. So thank you all very much for having me with you. I mean, I break that question into two broad parts. One of which is, what does this mean for me if I'm doing business in Russia? And then what does this mean for me for the rest of the world? You know, my business in the rest of the world, even if I'm not not doing business in Russia. And I think the reality for folks who are doing business in Russia is you've obviously seen a very broad, coordinated international sanctions response. One major pillar of our work to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Not the only one. The military assistance has been a major pillar of work, but the economic work has obviously been a major pillar of work. And I think the reality is we're probably in a situation where more is coming. I mean, we are seeing Putin obviously refocus his war in the eastern part of Ukraine, and I think that is really a testament to the sort of heroic fight the Ukrainians have brought to Russia. But he does seem to be, continuing to pursue his military goals in eastern Ukraine, and you're going to see, I think, the West stand united against that, including on the economic front. So, I can't get into sort of previewing specific actions here, but I think you are going to see kind of a continued drumbeat of actions in the economic domain as he continues his war against Ukraine. I'm happy to talk, some of the specifics on that as we go forward. Again, I can't quite preview actions, but offer a little bit more color. Then I think there's the broad question of what does this mean if you're doing business, in the rest of the world? And I think here I'd focus on two things. One is obviously the supply chain impacts. We were fortunate in many ways that we were able to see this war coming, and I think that many companies, and I spoke to other White House officials, spoke to many companies that had kind of specific supply chain exposure to either Ukraine or to Russia that they were able to help prepare for a little bit. And so you're not seeing so much, product shortages here in the United States as a result of this war. But obviously there has been major impacts on a couple of key global markets, right? Energy. We could have a long discussion about the impacts on energy markets. But there are a couple of others that we're seeing impacts on. Food and agriculture comes to mind, and where we are very focused across the administration in responding to the food price spikes, particularly in the developing world. And I think you're going to see us be coming out in the coming kind of weeks with some specific announcements about steps we are taking to help mitigate the global food impacts of this crisis. And then obviously the metals markets. Russia, we've not directly sanctioned Russian metals production generally, but there have clearly been impacts, and I think you're going to see us announcing some steps and some plans to try to help mitigate some of the metals market. So I think, the supply chain impacts of this are probably going to be with us for some time, certainly in terms of those price impacts. And it is incumbent on us, but very much working with business to figure out how to manage through and minimize, the impacts on supply chains of this conflict.
Aimen, are these indirect substantive pieces to Peter's answer? Are they areas that you're advising clients about? What do they represent in terms of the issues that are coming up, the risks that are coming up in the indirect space, to the extent you're advising people about the indirect part as opposed to the direct part?
Yeah, so obviously we're talking to companies about when they're doing an M&A transaction to think about what the implications are in terms of the supply chain issues. We're also continuing to talk to people about the fact that Russia actually it's not a new issue in the M&A space. It's an issue that has been at the center of national security reviews for many years, in fact, well before China. And it's clearly an issue that's driving a lot of the interest in Europe as well on FDI review. But one thing to note is that clearly if an entity or person is sanctioned, they're not going to be engaging in M&A transactions. But that doesn't mean that if an investor is a non-sanctioned entity, that there's no CFIUS-related or foreign investment review-related risk. Even investors who are on the outs with the Putin administration are not necessarily viewed as clean from a national security risk perspective. So in terms of companies that are receiving investment or funds that are raising capital, and as they're thinking about transactions, where there is a nexus to Ukraine or to Russia in terms of the investors, again, even if they're not sanctioned entities, it's a consideration that needs to be very much front of mind. In fact, last year, CFIUS took action with respect to an investor that had effectively rescued a satellite launch company from bankruptcy, where the investor had ties to Ukraine. So I mean, it's a real consideration even in the M&A space.
So Peter, we have a room full of people watching who are taking that first answer that you gave us with some trepidation, I would think. So there's so many issues to think about, and whether it's metals or fuel or food or any others that might come up. What can you say to the group to provide them some guidance as to what kinds of conversations they should be having on a forward-looking basis in the boardroom?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, first, just to the group, and I think we here across the Biden administration have very much sought to have an open door for business. We've been out briefing different types of companies, operating companies, the investor community, the banking community, really frankly going back to December and January. And I think the close conversations we have had has been part of how we have been able to structure the economic line of work against Russia in a way that, well, it has certainly been painful for individual companies, and we are seeing these kind of commodities market impacts. I think we have managed through quite effectively, right? You haven't seen major disruptions in global financial markets. I think that if you had asked a lot of financial experts back in December, if the United States puts Sparebank, one of the 10, larger than Lehman, right? When Lehman failed, if the United States put Sparebank on the U.S. SDN list, that would have, ripple effects across global financial markets. We've now sanctioned Sparebank on the SDN list. You've not seen those kind of ripple effects across global financial markets. So I don't want to minimize the kind of challenges individual companies are facing, but I think we have, from a kind of macro perspective, been able to design a set of policies that have really mitigated broader financial market impacts, broader kind of equities and bond market impacts and that kind of thing. It really is because we have had an open door and been able to consult very closely with a wide range of companies. And I think you're going to see us continue to take that approach going forward.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful. And I think for many of us who we view this as our remaining 18 minutes now to get a window into your mind and how you'll be thinking about this in the future. So can you give us as much of a window as you can into what's on the horizon, what other measures people in the boardroom should be thinking about in terms of sanctions in Russia, and then we'll broaden it out and talk about supply chain more generally.
Yeah, good, because I'd love to talk about supply chain more generally. I'd be interested in talking about China. I'm sure there are other places other than Russia that are very much on folks' minds. And I think there are some interesting implications on the supply chain front, given this war from Russia against Ukraine, as you think about China. I think there is a sort of very important set of lessons there. But look, I mean, I think that as as we go forward with the line of work against Russia, I think you'll continue to see us focus on the kinds of efforts that we have been undertaking over the last couple of months. So first, that means we're going to be very well synced up with our sort of key Western allies and partners. You've seen the lists aren't 100% aligned. We're realistic on that, but I think you have seen us, whether it is the financial line of effort against the Russian banks, whether it is the oligarch line of effort, or the Russian officials line of effort, or the kind of state-owned enterprises in Russia line of effort. I think you will see us continue to work in close partnership with our allies and partners. I do also think you'll see us work broadly on those lines of efforts. How can we continue to put macroeconomic and fiscal pressure on the Russian state by severing their ties from the international financial system and by going after major sources of state revenue? I think you'll see us go after the kind of, corrupt oligarch class that has benefited from Putin's rule, but who also often play an instrumental role in executing Putin's agenda in the West. So I think you're going to continue to see work there. I think you're going to see an increased focus on export controls. Export controls have been a key line of effort from the beginning, something we see as a valuable tool to degrade Russia's industrial production capacity. But I think there's more coming there with our allies and us. And I think often the export controls get overlooked. But if you look at, for example, why a number of industrial companies like automotive companies have suspended operations in Russia, some of it is, of course, the war, but it's also they can't find the parts for their factory lines. Russia's military is going to find the same problem as they look to rearm after losing all kinds of tanks and trucks and things in Ukraine, right? So a line of pressure that kind of continues to degrade that industrial production capacity is obviously also going to be a very important line of work.
I sort of just want to ask the two of you to engage in a conversation about supply chain for 5 minutes. So just go. So. I'm serious. What would you like to ask? We do have. I mean, for those of you who aren't aware, Peter has been, I think, one of the absolute top thought leaders on supply chain generally, not just with respect to China, but also in sort of integrating big picture thinking about technological competitiveness and sort of understanding national security very broadly. So let's have just a big picture conversation about how you see supply chain challenges globally for both of you. So if you'd like to start.
Yeah, there's the easy part. When China gets the ability, or when you strengthen China's chokehold over critical supply inputs, then that's certainly problematic. And I think the question then becomes, that's an easier one to address when in the M&A context, but is that the whole picture? And what about the need to have a domestic capability and domestic self-sufficiency separate and apart from your adversaries, but even with respect to when you look at your investment from your allies? One thing, Peter, I'd be interested in your thoughts is when you think about supply chain, and you think about supply chain security, how much of it is external driven, so threats from China, and how much of it is internal driven, independent of who the foreign supplier is? We still want to have a domestic capability that would address any concerns in a time of, say, pandemic or a time of shortage, like semiconductors and so on.
No, I think it's a great question, and I would say, if I'm stepping back for a moment, if I think about our strategic approach to supply chain, something that President Biden came into office focused on. He signed an executive order on supply chain resilience about 30 days into office, and it's been a major focus, going back for really to the beginning of the administration. I'd say in some ways we've had two big lines of work. One has been dealing with all of the near-term disruptions that all of you in this room and companies all over the country have been dealing with, right? So we've had a line of work that is, how do we help clear container backlogs in California and in Savannah? And I think we've had some success at that, right? I think long dwell ship times are down like 70% from their peak in the fall. We've been working to, address the trucking shortage and the truck driver shortage. So, the line of work that's very much kind of a tactical, how do we deal with the near-term choke points and bottlenecks? And then we have a line of work that is really about the resilience agenda and ensuring that going forward we have structurally more resilient supply chains. I would say within both those lines of work, there is both a domestic component and an international component. So take the international component, for example. Last fall, one of the big supply chain challenges we face here in the U.S. with our automotive industry was COVID outbreaks in Southeast Asia were causing semiconductor plants to shut down. And so we had a tactical line of effort to go out to help some of these plants in Southeast Asia get back online by adopting new COVID protocols and then by getting the local governments to let the plants reopen. So that's a tactical line of work overseas dealing with a near-term, sort of a near-term disruption. On the sustained investment front, obviously we are trying to get Congress to pass the CHIPS Act, which will foster tens of billions of dollars of additional semiconductor investment here in the U.S. To rebuild our semiconductor production, particularly in high-end chips here in the U.S. But the resilience agenda also has an international component. If you look at critical minerals, for example, we're simply not going to mine all of them that we need. There's not enough. There is cobalt in the U.S. We're trying to increase cobalt production in the U.S., but there's not going to be enough cobalt to fill all the electric vehicle batteries that are going to be sold in the United States in 10 or 12 years. So we have to have an international side of that as well. How do we, get Western firms playing more in Congo, which has a lot of cobalt? How do we work with the Australians, which also has some? So across both the domestic and across both the near-term disruptions and the long-term resilience agenda, I think you've seen us work both here at home. Yes, we want to capture those opportunities and have resilience here. And we've worked internationally. And that brings me, to one of the core points, which I think is a lesson of just the last couple of years on supply chains, which is that you need diversity in your supply chain. You don't want to be stuck as a sort of single point of failure that, a natural disaster or geopolitics could interfere with. I mean, as an investor I was talking with in New York a couple of weeks ago put it, like, no one wants to be a German energy company today, right? Where you're stuck nearly 100% reliant on a national adversary for a key input, and you got your choices you're facing are, well, I can screw my customers by hiking prices, I can screw my shareholder by eating all the losses, or I can beg my government to solve the problem. And that's just not a situation anybody wants to be in. And so I think the lesson of a bunch of these events for both industry and government is we really need to be thinking about having that kind of diverse and resilient supply chain. So even if it breaks down in one part of the world, there's other sources of the key input, able to be brought online to fill the gap.
And maybe, Frank, I can bring that back to the M&A context where, historically, one would think about who the investor is when you're thinking about whether or not there's a risk in the national security context. I think increasingly we're in a world where it's not just who the investor is, it's what the asset that's being that's the subject of the investment is, so that you may have an investor that really is not a company of concern or investor of concern, but if what they're investing in is something where there's a need to have critical capability in the United States, and if the business plan, for example, would suggest that there might be offshoring of that capability, then even if it's a friendly investor, that's not necessarily one that's going to go unnoticed. So I think that makes it more important now in deal planning and thinking about investors or where you're going to take investment from, to think about what the business objective is and how the government may view that in terms of its impact on the U.S. assets. It used to be the case that CFIUS would not, unless there was a government supply relationship, impose on the U.S. on a transaction a requirement that production facilities be maintained. But I could see in coming years that starts to change, especially as it relates to inputs and supplies that are viewed as being critical in and of themselves.
And this all becomes even more complicated if we layer in restrictions on outbound investment, and many people are thinking about the conversation that's happening around that right now. Could you spend a couple of minutes, Peter, just giving us your wisdom on, for people who are thinking about M&A or joint ventures or alliances that potentially could be impacted, sort of where thinking about that stands, and then I have one big question to ask both of you after you're done with that.
You're really asking me the easy and non-sensitive questions here. No, but
I think that's really why I was brought in to do this. So yeah.
No, it's a really important question. I know it is one that is very much on the mind of investors and on the business community writ large. And first thing I'd say is obviously there's some discussion on Capitol Hill about this in the context of the what we're now calling the bipartisan innovation law, the Compete Act that passed the House, and the SECA Act that passed the Senate. And I'm not really well positioned to speak to exactly the dynamics that will be going on Capitol Hill over the next couple of months, and where that will land. What I will say is, from an executive branch perspective, you've seen the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talk about this publicly. We do think there are categories, frankly, pretty narrow and tightly scoped categories of investment, U.S. investment overseas, particularly in kind of competitor nations. Obviously, it's a small category of nations where, there are national security risks that need to be evaluated. You saw some of that in our decision last April to update and overhaul the restrictions on portfolio investment in certain Chinese military-linked companies, right? There's concern about U.S. capital underwriting Chinese, companies linked to Chinese military and Chinese surveillance technology. But as the National Security Advisor said, I think there are also categories of kind of direct investment, that just raise interesting questions about gaps in U.S. policy and potential risks. So to give kind of an example of conceptually how we think about this, no decisions of administration policy here, but look, we have a very active program on maintaining U.S. semiconductor superiority. We are seeking money to create semiconductor, fabs here in the U.S. with a strong set of export controls related to high-end semiconductor investments in China and then other sort of competitor countries. We're joined by our allies and partners in that. But, it is true, American and other international investors can go ahead and invest in the creation of high-end semiconductors in China. And that does seem to be a little bit of a gap in our toolkit that Taiwan and South Korea, for example, don't have, right? If you're a Taiwanese, South Korean investor, you actually have to notify, and in the Taiwanese case, actually get some permission for certain kinds of high-end semiconductor investments. And so, we are kind of continuing to evaluate this issue. We are looking at, in a kind of rigorous way, what we think the gaps in the existing toolkit are, and whether it would make sense to try to address them again in a very kind of tightly scoped and fashioned kind of way, dealing with real national security risks, not sort of a broad category of amorphous risk, but where we see a really kind of defined national security risk.
Thank you so much. And let me just say we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. Thank you for the specificity of these responses. And I can tell you the room, you can't see the room, but I'm just reading the room. People are riveted by this. They're very, very appreciative, I think, of you being so specific. And so I just want to thank you before I ask you the last question, so now you get a softball. Okay, both of you actually get a softball. We talked a little bit about this, but one of the things I think is helpful for people to have a window into is just stylistically how this administration and people in your position or people who had Aimen's position and the previous 2 administrations, just stylistically how they're different. And so if you could just kind of give us a feel for how you think this administration stylistically is different, and then Aimen will react, and that's what we'll leave the crowd with.
Oh, I actually don't want to. I mean, I'm not going to comment on our predecessors. I mean, I actually know a number of my predecessors. I think they, are very hardworking and had good and have good relations. So I don't want to comment on the style of our predecessors. What I would comment on is, the approach we are trying to take, which is to be open and forthright. To consult widely with stakeholders, wide range of stakeholders, and everybody from labor to corporate boardrooms, and to make sure that we are informed by the best kind of actual evidence in front of us. And so, we talk a lot about having an open door policy, wanting companies to come in and see us. We mean it. We can't make the best decisions unless we know what's going on. So that's certainly been the approach on the economic policy making front that we have endeavored to take.
Aimen, do you have any reaction? And by the way, I'm going to show that to my students as the best possible answer to that question. That was perfect. So thank you for that. But Aimen, do you have any reaction to you served in the previous 2 administrations? Are there differences that you're noticing that are important for your clients, or give us a feel for how things are different now versus when you were there?
And I actually might start in the opposite, saying that there's actually in some areas there's a remarkable consistency. And I was there at the beginning through the Obama administration, and then for half of the Trump administration on issues on some of these issues, especially in the foreign investment space. There's remarkable consistency, I think, from the end of the Obama administration through the Trump administration and now into the Biden administration. I think what that means is that even if there's another change of administration, whether it's to another Democratic administration at some point or to a Republican administration, some key aspects of what we see now in terms of concerns related to technological competitiveness, supply chain, and so on are going to persist. And I also think it means that business can expect that the government interest in the innovations in the commercial space are going to continue to be of key interest to the government in terms of protecting them and building them, which means that we're going to have a lot more conversations like this about the impact of government regulation and government policy priorities on the ability of companies to pursue their business, even where they don't have any, their business doesn't have any direct connection to the government. They're not government contractors, they're not taking government funding, but because there's such a confluence between where the government's interests are from a national security point of view and where the commercial opportunity is, I think that point of meeting and that point of potential opportunity and friction is going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Well, one of the reasons we wanted to have the two of you together was to be able to reflect across administrations, and I think that was an incredibly helpful set of insights. In a time of uncertainty, one of the themes of this afternoon has been uncertainty, and obviously the world is uncertain, but I think we'll all agree that we feel less uncertainty now than we did 29 minutes ago. So thanks to both of our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.